Old man was forced out of his seat. What the pilot did moments later left everyone in tears. He was asked to move. Just one seat. Just this once. That's what they said. And 9 minutes later, the captain walked out of the cockpit and did something no one saw coming. What happened next didn't just change the flight. It reminded every person on board what dignity looks like when no one's watching. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where true stories of integrity, sacrifice, and quiet heroism are told without fanfare, just the way they happened. If stories like this mean something to you, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Let's begin. The early boarding announcement echoed through Terminal E at Zurich International. Elias Romero, age 79, stood with a slight lean to the left. The limp was permanent now, carved into his stride decades ago by something that didn't break the skin but broke the bone. He didn't look around or tap his phone or fidget with his bag. He just waited. Calm. Tired, maybe, but steady. When his group was called, he approached the gate with a quiet nod to the attendant, boarding pass already in hand. No small talk. No requests. Just a simple thank you as he crossed the threshold and stepped into the jet bridge. This was Flight SK-178 bound for Washington, D.C., a nearly 10-hour haul across the Atlantic. He'd booked it 3 months ago, on a limited pension, selecting seat 14C. Aisle. Premium economy. Just enough room to keep his left knee from locking up. Just enough to endure the trip. Not comfort. Just function. He didn't complain when he stepped into the cabin and found people already halfway settled, some still fussing with overhead bins. He moved slowly, deliberately, one hand on the seat backs as he passed, until he found his row. 14C. He lowered himself into the aisle seat with practiced care, winced slightly as his leg bent, and exhaled as it settled. He placed his small tin duffel under the seat ahead, folded his hands in his lap, and let his eyes rest. He had 20 minutes until takeoff. The seat was his. The worst part was over. Then came the interruption. She approached with a soft step and a practiced smile. The nameplate read Harumi, her uniform perfect, her tablet glowing softly in her hand. "Excuse me, sir," she said, with politeness shaped by policy. "Are you seated in 14C?" Elias turned. "Yes. I'm sorry, but we have a family with 3 young children who've been separated during booking. Your seat is part of the only 3-seat block we can offer them together." He looked at her evenly. "This seat was booked for medical reasons. My leg can't handle a middle row." "We understand, sir," she said gently. "It's just for this flight." She smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We'd really appreciate your cooperation." Elias glanced toward the front. A young mother was shifting from foot to foot, a toddler on her hip, 2 small kids hovering behind. He looked down at his hands, fingers curled from age and time, but still steady. "What seat are you offering?" he asked. 35B, she replied. "It's toward the back. Middle seat." He blinked. "Middle. It's the last available option. No aisle. No legroom. Near the lavatories. No relief for the next 10 hours. He took a slow breath. "I paid for this seat. It wasn't a random assignment. I understand, sir, but if you choose not to move, we may not be able to close the doors on time." There it was, the quiet pressure dressed as polite necessity. The implication: if you don't move, everyone's waiting on you. His jaw tightened. He wasn't being difficult. He'd planned this flight carefully. But now, with 30 pairs of eyes beginning to notice, he was suddenly the hold-up. The old man who wouldn't move. The problem. "I'd like it noted," he said, rising slowly, "that I gave up a medically necessary seat under pressure." She nodded, tapping her screen. The family was already being ushered forward. As Elias gathered his duffel and turned toward the back, the toddler looked at him and smiled. He managed a nod. No anger, just tired acceptance. Seat 35B was everything he expected. Narrow, tight, wedged between 2 strangers. The air smelled of ammonia and stale coffee. As he lowered himself carefully, pain spiked through his thigh. His knee, already worn from old fractures, was trapped now. No space to extend. No aisle to pivot toward. On his right, a teenager with earbuds scrolled through a playlist. On his left, a man in a suit tapped away at a laptop, elbow halfway into Elias's space. Neither acknowledged him. He didn't expect them to. He didn't ask for anything. He just folded his hands again, this time across his stomach, and leaned back as best he could. The cabin around him moved. Luggage clicked into place. Safety announcements began. But inside 35B, time slowed. His leg pulsed with a steady ache. No one saw. No one knew. Except one. A woman 3 rows ahead across the aisle. She had boarded just before him, set her laptop aside, and had quietly witnessed it all. Her name was Amira Khalid, a journalist traveling home to New York. She hadn't intervened then. But now, phone in hand, she typed a message. Brief. Factual. Directed to a contact in the airline's customer liaison office. She hit send. The seatback screen in front of Elias flickered to life. He didn't care what was playing. The only thing he felt was the ache, slow, steady, inescapable. He adjusted his position, then again, just to keep the joint from freezing. He wasn't mad. Not visibly. Not verbally. But his face, drawn and quiet, said everything. He'd lived long enough to understand what it meant to be inconvenient. To be overlooked. To be tolerated but not accommodated. He didn't know anyone had noticed. He didn't know his name had reached the cockpit. He didn't know a pilot had just removed his headset, stood up, and quietly said, "Hold position." That was still to come. Amira Khalid hadn't planned to notice him. She'd boarded with Group 2, laptop slung over one shoulder, blazer folded across her arm, moving with the reflexes of someone who traveled often and trusted no one with her carry-on. She found her seat quickly, 17A, window side, 2 rows behind the man they later made move. She didn't notice him at first. Not until the commotion started. She looked up when the young flight attendant stopped beside his seat, voice gentle but clipped, saying something about a family needing to sit together. Amira saw the older man respond without raising his voice. His tone was calm, but there was a pause, and something in that silence made her turn fully toward the aisle. She watched his eyes move, not angry, not resistant, just measuring the cost, the negotiation that happens in silence. She recognized that moment because she'd lived through it, just in different forms, different languages, different terminals. When he stood and handed over the seat he'd paid extra for, she expected something: acknowledgement, apology, even quiet appreciation from those who benefited. There was none. The mother ushered her children into the seats like it was owed. The flight attendant nodded and moved on. The man turned with slow motion and began walking toward the rear of the cabin. Amira didn't know him, but in that moment, she knew enough. The quiet resignation, the limp, the absence of indignation even when wronged. He didn't perform his sacrifice. He endured it. When he passed her row, their eyes met for less than a second. He didn't glare, didn't speak, just kept going. And that, more than anything, stayed with her. She watched him settle into 35B, his movements precise, controlled, like each bend of the knee came at a cost. No one helped him. No one paused to give him a second look. To the teenager beside him, he was background. To the businessman on the other side, he was an obstruction. Amira didn't reach for her camera or phone. She wasn't there to document pain for clicks. But her instinct kicked in: report, respond, intervene. Not loudly. Not for spectacle. Quietly, surgically. She tapped her phone, pulled up her contacts, and typed a message. Her friend Lena worked at Sky Atlas Air's public relations office in New York. Not front desk. Not customer service. Strategic relations. The kind of position that could push something up the chain if needed. Her message was simple: Passenger Elias Romero, seat 14C, moved against medical need for family accommodation. Now in 35B. Crew dismissive. Flight SK 178. Please escalate. She didn't expect a dramatic reversal. This wasn't that kind of world. But silence, she'd learned, is a choice. And sometimes the only thing louder than noise is presence. She kept watching him. Not with pity. With attention. He sat still, hands folded, face turned forward. He didn't fidget. He didn't sigh loudly or shift for attention. But every few minutes, he adjusted in his seat, just slightly, shifting weight off his left side. A gesture of pain, subtle but unrelenting. Once, he rubbed his knee. Not like a man complaining, like a man surviving. The teenager on his right remained deep in whatever playlist was blasting through his headphones. The man on the left continued typing on his laptop, elbows still dominating the shared armrest. The attendant came by once, asked nothing, glanced without registering, and moved on. Amira watched all of it, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something rare for a journalist who's seen too much: disbelief. Her phone buzzed again. Lena had responded, sending to ops. I'll flag as urgent. That was all. No guarantee. But it meant the note had left the floor of noise and reached someone with keys to the upper room. Amira leaned back, slid her phone into the pocket of her seat, and stared out the window. The jet hadn't moved yet. They were still on hold, probably for cargo clearance or air traffic. She turned her head slightly, eyes tracing the profile of the man still seated in 35B. The creases on his face told a story, not just of age, but of strain. Time had written itself deeply across his skin, the kind of markings earned, not inherited. One of his fingers bent slightly sideways at the middle joint. His hands were large, not from bulk, but from use. He looked like someone who had once carried others, not things. She didn't need his biography to know who he was. You can tell a great deal about a person by how they respond to injustice without applause, and how they carry pain no one else acknowledges. Elias Romero wasn't looking for validation. He hadn't argued. He hadn't made a scene. But in every inch of how he sat, he carried the invisible weight of having been sidelined yet again. Like it wasn't the first time. Like it wouldn't be the last. The plane doors finally closed with a dull metallic thump. The lights shifted. The safety briefing began. But no one near 35B was paying attention. The businessman kept typing. The kid adjusted his headphones. Elias sat still. Amira saw the way he tried to shift his left leg again. Small movements, the kind that meant the pain had started to stiffen, but there was no space to stretch it out. She could feel her own muscles tense, mirroring his discomfort, empathy converting into frustration. She didn't look away. Not once. When the attendant walked past again, she hoped, irrationally, that the woman might offer water or ask if he needed anything. Nothing. Eyes forward. Service neutral. Policy above perception. Amira had flown enough to know how that mask worked. She'd worn it herself once. But now, as she looked around the cabin, at the passengers lost in screens and silence, she felt something stir. Not outrage. Something older. A responsibility. She reached for her phone again. This time, not to send another message. Just to check if her initial note had been opened. Read receipt. Yes. 37 seconds ago. Acknowledged. Ops notified. Captain may be informed. That was all. Vague, corporate, but better than nothing. The jet rumbled. Taxiing began. Seatbelt lights flickered on. The co-pilot's voice came through overhead, monotone, efficient. We've been cleared for runway 8R. Flight time just over 9 hours. Smooth weather ahead. Sit back, relax, and thank you for choosing Sky Atlas. Routine. Scripted. But Amira didn't relax. She watched 35B. Watched Elias shift again, one shoulder tilting forward, trying to make space for his left knee to breathe. The man beside him didn't flinch, elbow still rooted to the armrest. That was the thing about discomfort. It's only ever visible to those who choose to see it. And then something happened. It started with a pause. Just long enough to feel intentional. The seatbelt sign didn't go off. The engine pitch lowered slightly. Amira glanced up. The cabin crew, still in position, exchanged looks. One of them reached toward the front panel. She couldn't hear anything yet, but she could sense it. A shift. A silence that carried meaning. The kind of silence that comes before something unexpected. From her window seat in 17A, Amira leaned just enough to see the front of the aircraft. The cockpit door was opening. Slowly, purposefully, and a man stepped out. He wasn't tall, but he carried height and posture. Uniform pressed, silver wings on his chest, stripes crisp on his shoulder. The pilot, Captain Mark Vandenberg. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He scanned the cabin with eyes that knew exactly what they were looking for. Every passenger who noticed him instinctively quieted. Phones lowered. Conversations paused. Because something about his walk said this wasn't a routine check. This was different, that he moved with control. Not theatrical. Not performative. Purposeful. Amira sat very still. She felt the moment stretch. Felt the shift in the air as Captain Vandenberg walked past row 17 without turning his head, eyes fixed ahead. Toward 35B. Elias Romero was still seated, unaware. His eyes half closed. Not asleep, just retreated. Then he looked up. The cabin lights caught in his glasses. And for a second, confusion flickered across his face. He saw the pilot and stopped moving. Captain Vandenberg came to a full stop beside him. No words yet, just presence. Then, In one sharp motion, he raised his right hand in formal salute. The plane went silent. Amira held her breath. Elias blinked slowly. His back straightened just a little. Reflex or instinct, no one could say. Then the captain spoke, his voice low but clear. "Staff Sergeant Elias Romero," he said. "On behalf of this airline, and as a former officer of the NATO Rapid Response Forces, I apologize. What happened here today was wrong, and we're going to fix it." Amira felt her throat tighten. Around her, passengers had turned. Someone whispered. Someone else reached for their phone, but no one dared speak over the captain's voice. "You will not sit here," Captain Vandenberg said. "You will be escorted to seat 1A. Immediately, Elias didn't answer. Not right away. The captain turned slightly, eyes scanning. "Miss Hirumi Sato?" he asked. The attendant appeared from the galley, startled. "Yes, Captain. You will personally escort this gentleman to 1A. If that seat is occupied, ask for a volunteer. If no one volunteers, inform them the captain of this aircraft is requesting it for a combat veteran." Hirumi looked pale. She nodded without speaking. Elias began to rise, but Vandenberg lifted a hand. "Please, let us help." He reached forward, steadying Elias with a hand under the elbow. The man in the aisle seat beside them stood without a word. Even the teenager removed his headphones. The cabin wasn't moving, but something had already shifted. Amira sat frozen, eyes full, heart quiet. This wasn't a headline. This was something else, something rare, and it was only just beginning. Captain Mark Vandenberg had seen thousands of names flash across the cockpit display during pre-flight updates. Passenger adjustments, service flags, dietary codes. Most of them meant nothing, just data points in a moving system. But when the message came through from Ops and the name Elias Romero lit up in bold red type, something inside him stopped. The text was brief, no more than 2 lines. Passenger Elias Romero. Moved from medically reserved seat due to seating conflict. Confirmed veteran. Flight SK 178. The captain's hand froze on the checklist. His co-pilot, a younger man named Nolan, continued calling out pre-taxi procedures, unaware that his captain's eyes were no longer on the instruments. Mark didn't say anything at first, just stared at the name. His breath slowed. The recognition wasn't instant. It arrived in layers, each one heavier than the last. The surname, the service connection. Sarajevo, 1995. Then it hit. His father's voice, half a lifetime ago. "There was a field medic in Bosnia who saved my life when the outpost was bombed. Dutch convoy. UN unit. He crawled back into a burning vehicle to pull me out. Never got his name. I think he was Spanish. Limped like hell. But he never left a man behind. Elias Romero. That was the name. That had to be him." Mark turned toward Nolan. "Hold the taxi." Nolan blinked. "Sir." "Hold position. I'll be back in 3. Mark unbuckled, stood up, adjusted his cuffs. His heart wasn't racing. He didn't feel adrenaline. He felt certainty. Measured. Quiet. This wasn't a decision. It was a return. He stepped out of the cockpit and made eye contact with the lead flight attendant, who approached immediately. "Yes, Captain?" she asked, concerned. "Where is the passenger who was moved from 14C? She hesitated. "Row 35. Middle seat." "Thank you," Mark said. He started walking. Not fast. Not slow. Just with purpose. The cabin didn't react right away. People noticed movement at the front, but assumed it was standard. Until they saw his face. The pilot walking down the aisle. Not with a smile. Not with casual conversation. With intent. With stillness. And slowly, awareness spread. Phones were lowered. Voices quieted. Heads turned. Mark reached row 35 and stopped. Elias Romero sat hunched slightly, not from fear, but fatigue. The fatigue of a body built to endure more than its fair share. He looked up, and time stalled. Recognition passed through him. He didn't speak. Not yet. Mark stood straight, heels locked, raised his right hand, and saluted sharply. The sound of the cabin faded. For a full 3 seconds, there was nothing but breath. "Staff Sergeant Elias Romero," Mark said, loud enough for the first 10 rows to hear. "On behalf of Sky Atlas Airlines, and as a former officer of the NATO peacekeeping mission in Sarajevo, I offer you my deepest apologies. You were moved from your seat in error. And that stops now." Elias blinked slowly. He hadn't stood yet. He hadn't said a word. His eyes searched Mark's face, not for validation, but for sincerity. And it was there. every syllable spoken with reverence. Mark turned to Harumi, who had arrived silently, clutching her tablet. "Miss Sato," he said, "escort Mr. Romero to seat 1A. "Captain, that seat is, if it's occupied," Mark continued, "ask for a volunteer. If no one volunteers, inform them that the captain is requesting it. Not suggesting, not advising, requesting. For a man who gave more than most of us ever will." Harumi hesitated, nodded, and turned toward the front. Elias began to rise, slow and measured. Mark extended a hand. Elias didn't resist. His left knee bent with effort. The man beside him moved, almost stumbling as he stood. The student on the other side unplugged his headphones, lowered his head. Mark didn't release Elias's elbow until he was balanced. Then, without a word, they began walking forward. Row by row, people sat frozen. No one filmed. No one whispered. It wasn't the silence of obligation, it was respect. The kind of silence that rarely visits a plane at cruising altitude. Elias walked slowly, his steps uneven, but his head high. Mark walked behind him, eyes steady. Harumi stopped at the front, turning toward 1A. A man in a suit was seated, sipping water. He looked up, confused. Harumi's voice cracked slightly. "Sir, I'm sorry. We'll need to reassign your seat." "What? Why?" "Captain's request," she said. "This is for a veteran." The man looked up and saw Elias. Saw the duffel, the face, the fatigue. He stood without a word. "Sir," he said softly, "it's yours." Elias nodded once. No dramatics. No performance. He sat. Mark looked to Harumi again. "If that seat had not been given, I would have reassigned my co-pilot's jump seat," he said, his voice calm. "And if that wasn't available," he paused, "I would have given up mine." He didn't say it for drama. He said it because it was true. The cabin remained silent. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for more. Just listens. Elias sat back, exhaled, and looked out the window. He didn't smile, but his shoulders eased just slightly. For the first time in hours, the weight wasn't pressing downward. Mark nodded once and returned to the cockpit. Nolan looked up. "Everything all right?" "Now it is," Mark said. "Let's fly." But before they pushed back, he adjusted the intercom, pressed the switch, and spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Before we take off, I want to acknowledge something. Today, we failed a passenger. We asked a decorated combat veteran, someone who served in humanitarian missions most of you have never heard of, to surrender his seat, one booked in advance for medical needs, because of a system that sometimes forgets to think." He paused. The silence held. "But we don't leave people behind. Not in the air. Not on the ground. Not in Sarajevo. Not at 30,000 feet. And especially not in seat 35B. The cabin didn't cheer. Not yet. That came later. What they gave first was stillness. Stillness wrapped in a kind of reverence only truth earns. The kind of moment where no one speaks because there's nothing to add. Mark clicked off the mic. He looked forward. Elias Romero looked out the window, hands now resting comfortably on his lap. Seen. Acknowledged. Returned. It wasn't about first class. It was about something else. Something that doesn't come with legroom or meal choice or priority boarding. It was about dignity. And how, sometimes, all it takes is one name to bring it back. The moment Elias sat down in seat 1A, something shifted. It wasn't just the extra room or the leather cushion or the clean air near the front of the cabin. It was the dignity of it. The silence surrounding him wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something unspoken, reverent. Passengers who'd looked past him earlier now lowered their gaze as he passed. No one clapped. No one filmed. But there was a collective stillness, the kind that rises when something long overdue has finally arrived. Captain Mark Vandenberg remained standing until Elias was fully seated. Harumi brought him a bottle of water without being asked. Another crew member followed with a folded blanket, placed gently at his side. Elias said nothing. He didn't ask for thanks. He didn't need ceremony. But what he got was something rarer, recognition. Then came the voice. Row 5, aisle seat. A man with graying temples and a blue travel hoodie slowly stood. His hands trembled slightly as he braced the seat in front of him for balance. His eyes were locked on Elias, who had just leaned his head back against the seat rest. "Sir," the man said, voice catching halfway through. Elias opened his eyes, confused at first, then straightened as he studied the man's face. "I don't know if you remember me," the man said, "but I've remembered you every day since." He paused. Croatia. Camp Cordon, 1993. You were the only medic who came back for us after the convoy was hit. Elias didn't answer immediately. The face was older now, but the eyes, there was something there. Then slowly, like dust clearing from memory, he nodded. Raymond, he said, barely audible. Raymond Chu. The man swallowed hard, nodded fast, almost unable to speak. You saved my life, he said. You carried me across a burning field. I never thought I'd see you again. And now, I just want to say thank you. The words broke in his throat. He sat down quickly, both hands covering his face, not to hide, but to hold together what emotion couldn't. Elias looked away, but not out of discomfort. He stared forward, past the curtain, past the first-class wall, and into something else entirely. He didn't cry. He just breathed, deeply, slowly, as if that breath was the first in a long time not taken underweight. The cabin resumed its quiet, but it was no longer passive. It was heavy with meaning. The businessman who'd been tapping away at his keyboard in 35A now looked straight down at his hands. The teenager who'd worn earbuds blinked at the back of Elias's head with something like guilt, or maybe awe. No one said a word, but everything had changed. Harumi returned to her station, her posture straighter than before. When the service began, no one asked questions about delays. No one complained. The attendants moved like something sacred had occurred, because it had. They offered drinks, but their hands were more careful. Even the way they spoke had softened. Captain Vandenberg stayed in the cockpit. He didn't make another announcement. He didn't need to. The one he'd made before takeoff still hung in the air, replaying in everyone's mind. It wasn't about policy or compensation. It was about a simple truth, that a man who had given so much had, for too long, been asked to give even more in silence. That silence had now been broken. Midway through the flight, Elias asked for nothing. He didn't sleep, but he rested. His knee was still stiff, still ached, but the pain didn't carry shame with it now. He shifted occasionally, but the motion was no longer one of restraint. It was recovery. About 2 hours in, another passenger, a woman this time, mid-30s, stopped near first class during her walk down the aisle. She hesitated, then reached out gently and placed her hand over her heart. She didn't say anything. She just nodded toward him, then moved on. Elias nodded back, not out of obligation, but acknowledgement. The exchange took 4 seconds. It spoke more than words could. Further down, Amira Khalid sat in seat 17A, hands still on her lap. She hadn't touched her laptop. She hadn't touched her drink. She just watched, quietly. Watched how one man's quiet endurance had reshaped the dynamic of 100 strangers. She didn't smile, but something in her eyes had softened. Her phone buzzed once. Lena again. Saw it, head ops. Pilot escalated personally. Glad you said something. Amira didn't respond. She didn't need to. This wasn't about credit. It was about course correction. When meal service reached the front cabin, Elias politely declined. The crew insisted. They didn't pressure. They simply said, "It's already been prepared, sir." It would be an honor. He nodded once. That was enough. As he ate, slowly, the cabin buzzed with the low murmur of 1,000 adjusted perspectives. People who had rushed through terminals, fought for overhead space, worried about upgrades and delays, were now sitting still, thinking. In the back, the man who had taken Elias's seat, seat 14C, now looked visibly uncomfortable. Not because someone had scolded him. No one had. But because sometimes honor is so undeniable that it reflects everything else back as pale. He glanced forward now and then, but he didn't move. He didn't need to. That wasn't the point. The point wasn't revenge. It was clarity. A little before landing, one of the junior crew approached Elias with a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten card. On the front, the Sky Atlas logo in gold. Inside, a single line. From all of us, thank you for showing us what service really looks like. It wasn't corporate. It wasn't branded. Just honest. Elias read it once, folded it neatly, and tucked it into his duffel bag. As the plane began its descent, the usual instructions played. Return seats upright. Tray tables up. But everything felt slower. More thoughtful. No one was in a hurry to reclaim the rush of ordinary. The crew moved with a different rhythm now. Not out of obligation, but because something had changed midair. A man had been seen, and everyone knew it. When the wheels touched down, there was no cheer, no clapping. Just a long collective breath. Like something sacred had ended, and everyone was afraid to disturb it. Elias remained seated as others stood. No one jostled him. No one reached over. A man behind him simply placed a hand on the seat as he passed and nodded, eyes misty. Another paused by his row and whispered, "Welcome home, sir." Elias didn't reply aloud. He just placed a hand gently over his heart. And when the doors finally opened and the first passengers stepped off, the first-class cabin waited. No one stood. They watched as Elias Romero gathered his things slowly, stood with the weight of years not bowed but borne, and stepped forward. Not alone, not invisible, but remembered. Finally, the plane landed just after noon. The touchdown was soft, almost ceremonial, as if even the wheels knew what had happened on board. Passengers gathered their things in silence, their energy more reverent than rushed. Some stole glances toward 1A. Others didn't look at all, not out of indifference, but out of respect. Elias Romero remained seated. He wasn't in a hurry. Not anymore. His hands rested on his knees. His shoulders didn't carry urgency. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like an afterthought. The flight attendants didn't just say thank you as he exited, they meant it. He looked them each in the eye. No nods. No pleasantries. Just presence. On the jet bridge, a woman stood holding a sign that read, "Welcome, Grandpa Elias." Leah Romero, 23 years old, straight-backed, wearing the pressed navy blue uniform of a graduating cadet from the Global Medical Defense Academy. Her face lit up when she saw him. She dropped the sign and ran. Elias didn't brace. He let the hug hit him full force. Her arms locked around his shoulders. He didn't wince when she clutched his side. "Your knee," she whispered, pulling back slightly. "I've had worse," he said. And this time, the smile on his face wasn't cautious. It reached all the way to his eyes. They stood there for a long moment, the kind of moment where history is quiet but real. That afternoon, they sat for hours. In a quiet airport cafe just outside baggage claim, Leah asked about everything. His flight, his seat, what happened. He didn't say much. Just said there'd been a mix-up. A man stood up. That's all. But her phone had already been buzzing since before she saw him. Her classmates had forwarded her a link. Someone had posted the intercom announcement online. It had spread fast. She hadn't watched it yet. Not fully. She wanted to hear it from him first. He only told her what she needed to know. That sometimes the world forgets people like him, and sometimes someone reminds it not to. She nodded. She didn't press. She just kept her hand over his for the rest of the meal. When they arrived home later that day, Elias found the envelope waiting. It had been forwarded from the airline's New York office. Inside, a letter printed on cream cardstock with the Sky Atlas logo embossed at the top. "Dear Mr. Elias Romero," it read. "On behalf of the Sky Atlas Board, executive leadership, and every employee who serves our passengers, please accept our sincerest apologies for the seating error on Flight SK-178. In recognition of your lifetime of service and the sacrifice you've carried, we are honored to designate you as a lifetime honor passenger. You will never again need to request accommodations. Your name alone will be sufficient. Wherever you need to go, we will take you there." Attached was a sleek card in black and gold with his name etched beneath the words, "Honor Passenger, Permanent Status." Elias didn't smile as he read it. He didn't even breathe differently. He just folded the letter neatly and slid it beside the small folded flag that sat in his study. A flag that had outlived friends, commands, and decades of silence. 3 days later, another envelope arrived. This one older in design, the kind of brown government issue that hadn't changed since the Cold War. It bore the stamp of the United Nations Office of Military Records. The return address, Geneva. He held it for a moment before opening. His hands didn't shake. Inside was a short letter, typewritten in a clean serif font. "Dear Mr. Romero," it began, "following a recent public inquiry and corresponding intergovernmental communication, we have reevaluated your service records with the Global Medical Corps unit stationed in Croatia in 1993. It has come to our attention that your field report from Operation Windmill Ridge was marked incomplete due to infrastructure loss during the conflict. That report has now been recovered. It details your retrieval and emergency treatment of 5 civilians and 3 injured NATO soldiers under live fire. We consider the omission of this citation an institutional failure. Your record will be updated to reflect full commendation status effective immediately. On behalf of the Office of Military Records, we extend our belated, but heartfelt, acknowledgement." Attached to the letter was a black and white scan of the original field citation, dated 1993, with two faded stamps across the bottom, one from the Croatian Defense Council, the other from the Dutch Forces Liaison. But that wasn't what made him sit down. It was the second page. A separate note. Handwritten. Dear Mr. Romero, I doubt you remember me. I was barely conscious when you pulled me out of that ravine. February 1993. You had a limp, a busted arm, and you still carried me a half-mile to safety. I was Corporal Toon Van Dersen back then. I'm General Van Dersen now. You didn't know it, but you gave me 32 more years. I made it home. I made a family. I've led 2 battalions. And not a single day has gone by where I didn't think of the man who didn't ask who I was. He just didn't leave me behind. You were never invisible. Not to us. No return address. Just a signature. Elias folded the note, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the wall. He didn't cry. He didn't say anything at all. Just let silence fill the room. That weekend, a local paper ran a short article. Nothing flashy, just a community piece. Veteran honored after in-flight tribute. A photo showed Elias stepping off the plane, Leah at his side, her arm looped through his. Within a week, the story was picked up nationally. A few journalists reached out. Amira Khalid wrote a full piece for a mid-size international outlet. It was simple, clean, no dramatization, just the facts. A man was asked to move. A pilot intervened. A lifetime was quietly restored. By month's end, the story had gone further than expected. Military publications reprinted it. University lectures cited it. Veterans halls in 5 countries tacked the photo of Elias in 1A onto their message boards. Not as a symbol of victory, as a reminder of what it means to see someone. Elias didn't change much. He still walked every morning to the mailbox. Still limped when it rained. Still took his coffee black and his eggs over hard. But something in him was quieter now. Less guarded. When someone approached him at the cafe, he no longer waved them off. When a neighbor asked if the man in the story was him, he just said, "Depends which part you're asking about." And sometimes, when he sat on the back porch in the early evening, Leah would find him staring at the horizon. She never interrupted, just sat next to him, quietly. Once, she asked him what it felt like to be recognized after all that time. He thought for a long while. Then he said, "It doesn't change what happened, but it changes what happens next." That was all. That was enough. Amira Khalid didn't embellish the story. She didn't need to. When she submitted her article to a mid-tier publication in New York, she simply titled it, "The Man in Seat 35B." The editors barely edited it. They knew. Within a day, the piece was reprinted. Then it was quoted. Then it was read aloud at a military graduation in Virginia. Within a week, the video of the in-flight announcement had crossed oceans. Shared by service members. Played at ceremonies. Paused in classrooms. Translated into 6 languages. What started as a quiet injustice had become something else entirely. Not a scandal, not a movement, but a reminder. A reminder of the people we pass by. The ones who carry more than their body shows. The ones who give without receipt. And the ones we forget until they're placed in the wrong seat, and suddenly everyone remembers what matters. The photo that caught on most wasn't dramatic. It wasn't taken during the salute or the captain's speech. It was simpler. Elias Romero sitting in seat 1A, hands folded, sunlight slipping across the back of his hand. You couldn't see his face, but you could feel the weight in his posture. Still. Solid. Seen. That photo was pinned on the wall of over 100 VFW halls before the month ended. It didn't shout. It whispered. And that whisper said, "Don't look away next time." Elias never cared about the coverage. He never answered interview requests. Never stood in front of microphones. When asked by neighbors, he just said, "It wasn't about me. It was about all of us who stayed quiet too long." He still walked with a limp. Still took his coffee black. Still sat on the porch at dawn and counted birdsong over headlines. But his shoulders sat differently now. Not higher. Just steady. People didn't stop him in the street for selfies. They nodded. A gesture that meant, "I heard. I saw. I remember." He didn't need the world to worship him. He only needed it to stop forgetting men like him existed. Sometimes, he'd catch Leah scrolling through her phone and spot another repost of the story. A flight attendant in Singapore. A journalist in Brazil. A professor in Montreal. Once, a young man from Bosnia had commented beneath one article, "My uncle was on that convoy. We always wondered who the medic was." "Thank you." Elias never replied. He just read. and folded the moment into his day like a quiet prayer. Stories like his aren't told to celebrate noise. They're told to honor quiet. Because quiet doesn't mean weak. Quiet is where strength lives without needing to be seen. And sometimes, it takes only one quiet act to echo far enough that the world finally turns around. So the next time you see someone sitting quietly, someone overlooked, someone no one stands up for, remember Elias Romero. And be the one who does. Because silence doesn't always mean acceptance. Sometimes it's just the moment before someone finally stands. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, if it reminded you that dignity still matters, share it. Leave a comment. Tell us about the person in your life who never asked to be seen, but deserves to be remembered. And most of all, subscribe to the channel for more true stories like this. Because sometimes, the smallest voices carry the deepest truths.